It's to introduce the lovely Susan Crowley from Crowley Associates. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's really appreciated. And over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. It's lovely to be invited to do this. And I've just been saying to Natasha, we're as almost flummoxed as all of you are about where planning is at the moment. But just to give you a little bit of context about us, so Crowley Associates is a planning consultancy based in Sheffield. We do have planners now in Altrincham and down in Nottingham and Derby. We work across all of the sectors in terms of development types. We're a small outfit, but we're nimble. We, in effect, deal with development management principally, so all of the issues around that, including appeals, expert witness work, site promotion, planning applications, etc., etc. As I say, yes, we're based in Sheffield, but we work throughout the UK, and we have just recently joined forces with a team of civil and structural engineers and geotech and environmentalists. So we've got a broader offer to all of you out there going forward, which is quite exciting for us. But enough of that. I'm here this evening, if you'd just like to move the slides on, Natasha. I'm here this evening to try and address planning's hot topics for 2024. And quite frankly, they're no different to the hot topics we saw in 2023. The biggest shift forward, I think, for everybody that we need to be mindful of is the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill has now been given royal assent, and as of the 26th of October became the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. That in of itself has given birth to two other planning mechanisms that I'm going to address with you. One is the Street Votes Development Order, yet to be introduced in terms of timetable, but currently out to consultation, and I'll address that separately with you because you can feed into that. And then we have a suite of national development management policies. Again, there is no timetable for their introduction, but they have become a formal instrument. In addition to the above, I'd like to briefly address biodiversity net gain again with you, but in this instance, I think we probably need to focus on two things. The fact that there's now a statutory biodiversity metric in place against which to undertake your valuations pre-application. And then completely separate to the LURA, lovely name, but we're calling the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act the LURA. We have, in fact, of last week, seen a consultation document come out from central government with reference changes to permitted development rights. I expect you as development and design specialist, you're going to be particularly interested in street votes and in the extensive PD rights that we're going to be looking at going forward. Thanks, Natasha. So if we can just move on. So let LURA commence. In effect, whilst stepping away from the radical ambitions of a Planning for the Future white paper on the back of which the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill was born, the Act actually still introduces big changes. And the centralising theme for planning continues. So the government is still very focused on lifting planning as a function almost out of the hands of local authorities, sharing the load then between the third sector, communities and central government. Some big ticket items that have fallen out the back of it in respect of development plan preparation, and this is huge. Previously, neighbouring authorities had to coordinate and cooperate with one another with reference to the preparation of their development plans, because as you can possibly imagine, there is a huge amount of cause and effect when neighbouring planning authorities have to work to different planning policy frameworks. Previously, they had to agree a statement of common ground and work across the boundaries cohesively. That duty to cooperate is no longer, and the Secretary of State has also introduced extensive powers to prescribe the form and content of local plans themselves, so that they deal with matters that are local to the local authority and the community the local authority serves. The Act also provides for new development management policies. This is now a statutory hook, and it's going to enable a suite of national policies to be introduced through a secondary legislation at a later date. We don't quite know when it is going to happen, but it is now a certainty. I'll talk a little bit more about those in a brief period. And then we have the biodiversity net gain provisions. The amendments that have been made and introduced by the Act relate principally to the methodology for valuing pre-development biodiversity values of on-site habitats and the enhancement of the biodiversity of a habitat. And they took effect on the 12th of February. So we now have a statutory biodiversity metric, which we can cover later. The Act, in addition, introduces powers for local authorities to issue completion notices against a development if the developer isn't building it out reasonably quickly. And it sets out the procedure for how those notices might be served. In addition, it's introduced a power for local authorities to decline to determine applications in cases of earlier non-implementation or unreasonably slow build-out. So if you've secured a planning permission, you're either not adhering to it, you've not commenced, or you're not building it out quickly enough, and then you go in to seek an amendment to that consent, you might be declined. The local authority can choose to turn your application away. And then finally, the Act introduces conditions, or the power to impose conditions relating to development progress reports on specified residential planning permissions. Now, as you might imagine, all of this is to incentivize developers to deliver housing principally, but it's a bit of a blunt tool, and there is no specification that it should relate to major development just now. It captures all development, so all development at all levels could or is now open to being issued with a completion notice, a local authority which declines to determine a resubmission, and potentially conditions being imposed around how your development might progress over a period of time. The other thing to fall out of it really is the removal of the 4-year enforcement rule. So the immunity rules are overhauled, and all breaches of planning permission can only be immune from enforcement action after a period of 10 years. This includes breaches such as changes of use of a building to residential or operational development, which previously became immune after 4 years without enforcement action. As yet, there is no timetable for the introduction of the 4-year rule shift. So my advice to anybody out there who has any client that's approached them around this particular issue, whilst you can capture any lawful development by way of the passage of time through a CLD or a CLU right now before the rules change. So in summary, what I would say about LURA is it's a framework for significant and wide-ranging changes, and it will impact almost every aspect of the English planning system. It doesn't apply in Wales at this present time, or Scotland. But the changes to planning enforcement and new regime for monitoring build-out rates are significant, and they're certainly going to impact on the way schemes are planned for and built out. There's likely to be need to be very transparent with local planning authorities about external or market forces that are impacting on a developer's ability or your client's ability to complete or build out a particular project. And as I've said, it would be very sensible to seek to formally regularise any schemes which benefit currently from immunity under the 4-year enforcement rule. Thank you, Natasha. So the first thing I'd like to address that's fallen out of the Act, and something that we're still quite puzzled about in the planning community, is the street vote development order. So it's being described by government as an innovative new tool to give residents the ability to propose development on their street, and subject to the proposal meeting certain requirements, including by way of examination by an inspector. They will be able to vote, these residents, on whether or not that development should be given planning permission. Now, this is not the same as permitted development. It goes far beyond that, and you as design professionals and development professionals should be acutely aware of this, because the expectation from central government in terms of how these proposals come forward and are adopted as a formal order is going to be contingent on these communities, streets, areas, appointing design professionals to support the development of a design code. So this isn't something where the government is going to produce a set of rules and we all adhere to them, and as long as we tick the boxes, all is good. This is going to come down to there being in the background a set of design requirements that are still under development and are being consulted upon, against which you will be supporting communities to develop design codes that will then enable detailed development to take place on their street or in that street area, immune from planning permission. So completely different to permitted development rights. I just want to stress that. The ambition behind this apparently is to support some development. These are the words of central government on land and existing settlements where this has the support of residents. I find it very interesting that the government has actually stated, and I quote, "The value of property may increase as a result of a street vote development order, so there's an incentive for homeowners to work with their neighbours to prepare one." So this is going to be very interesting. For any of you that are interested, by the way, in responding on the consultation, can I suggest you go to www.gov.uk, type in street vote development orders and have a good route around in there. It's very interesting. So the consultation started on the 22nd of December. The vision on the part of the government is guided by 3 principles: to create a predictable system where residents have a high degree of certainty on what proposals are permitted to contain. That means development proposals. To make the system accessible, this is the second principle, to make the system, i.e. planning system, accessible and easy to use so local people can take up the opportunity that street vote development orders provide, quote unquote. And the third principle, to create a robust system that enables residents to bring forward well-designed development on their street. So the intention is to grant express consent for certain development, and this is development at a detail level in defined areas. What makes the street vote development orders different from other routes to planning permission is that they're designed to encourage local residents to come together and set out a coherent vision for additional development on their street. We as professionals anticipate the policy will allow residents to propose and support development and street improvements that would otherwise not have happened. Government's intention is that they make better use of land and existing settlements. Other routes to planning, such as household planning applications, permitted development rights established by way of a certificate of lawful development or use, will continue to be available in areas where street vote development orders are in place. So it won't stop any resident from applying to go their own way. And of course, your permitted development rights will remain intact regardless of what the order actually introduces by way of change. In addition, communities will continue to be able to prepare neighbourhood plans or neighbourhood development orders in those areas. Thanks, Natasha. So this is an interesting one. They haven't quite figured out how we're going to define a street vote area or a development order area, but the Act sets out that street vote development orders can only be used to grant planning permission to development in a street area as defined in secondary legislation. So the consultation at the moment, obviously, is going to try and nail a definition that it will then put into secondary legislation in the form of regulation. But government is proposing that a street area is defined as the properties on each stretch of road, starting or ending at a crossroads or as a minor road at a T-junction, or where there is a gap between buildings of more than 50 metres. A street is to be treated as terminated if the continuous stretch of buildings is broken by a bridge wider than 3 metres. This applies to both the street running beneath and over the bridge. A residential property is counted as being in a street area if any part of its boundary runs along the highway, and the street area must have at least 10 residential properties within its boundary. And they're proposing that adjoining streets could be joined together to form one street area, for example, joining together 2 streets that have fewer than 10 residential properties. So already we can see the complexities around just defining an area of itself. Specific areas are going to be excluded. from the scope of a street vote development order or an SVDO. The intention behind this is to provide additional safeguards for sensitive areas, including conservation areas where development is either normally highly restricted or not permitted through other routes to planning permission. So the current list of excluded areas includes, as one might expect, the Article 3.2 land, so national parks of the Broads, World Heritage Site, or a buffer zone around a heritage site. An area notified as a site of special scientific interest, they're excluded under Section 28 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act. Areas defined as greenbelt land. So if you've got a settlement washed over by the greenbelt, an SVDO won't be able to come forward in that area, or you won't be able to bring one forward. And then finally, European sites within the meaning given by Reg 8 of the Conservation of Habitats and Species Regs. So any site with any kind of ecological or biodiversity sensitivity won't qualify for the order. And of course, as ever, the Secretary of State can add to that exclusion list or remove as at will, really. Thanks, Natasha. So what's interesting here is who can make a proposal. Eligibility criteria are interesting. So the government is proposing that those eligible to put forward an order or become part of a group wishing to do so must be eligible and registered to vote at the address at which they live on the date they anticipate the order is to be made, i.e. beyond the examination in public. Sorry, the date the proposal is to be submitted for its examination in public, not the date is to be made. So that's quite a big ask. That's assuming that we have a fairly static residential population in a particular area. So one immediately thinks, well, it's going to exclude a lot of our student areas where students either aren't registered to vote at the address at which they live, or they're moving about quite frequently. But notwithstanding that, that is the test immediately. So you have to be registered to vote at the address at which you live on the date. Your order is going to be submitted for its examination in public, a bit like a local plan. And that begs the question as well. So if somebody's a tenant in a property, believe it or not, they can put themselves forward to belong to the eligible group for the order, to prepare it and support its examination, but they don't have to own the building in which they live. The person who does own the building, who won't necessarily be registered at the address, let's say it's the landlord, they live remotely, obviously they can't put themselves forward, nor can they be made eligible in other respects to get involved with the preparation of the order. And so it begs the question, you know, what sort of conflict is that going to create? But the size of the group is interesting as well. I mean, you can see the table I've introduced there. Minimum number of residents, 10, and the minimum number of properties in that case where people need to be eligible to make the order is 10. And then there's a sliding scale downwards as the number of properties increases, the percentage of people who need to be eligible to vote decreases. So according to the government, the qualifying group must be comprised of at least the prescribed number of the prescribed proportion of persons of a prescribed description. I mean, we're already, you know, tapping our heads. Street areas must have at least 10 residential properties. In the case of street areas with between 10 and 25 residential properties, the government is proposing that different requirements will apply as per that table. In terms of development requirements, and this is the really interesting bit for you guys. So qualifying groups must submit a street design code to the examination, which sets out illustrated design parameters for physical development within the street area. And they are going to be very prescriptive in terms of the development requirements. I'm going to come on to those in a little while, but they're very interesting. The examination will follow once the proposal has been accepted and submitted for its examination. The planning inspectorate will take it over because the government wants to ensure that proposals are examined fairly and efficiently before they're put out to a referendum. after the proposal has been submitted for examination, if the examiner determines that it's sound and the requirements have been met, specifically design requirements, the qualifying group and the local planning authority will be notified. And then the returning officer of the local planning authority will put the matter out to a vote. And in that referendum, only those SVDOs that have strong local support will be adopted. So the vote, again, can only be registered by those who are registered at an address and are eligible to vote. And at least 60% of those who vote or eligible to vote must vote in favour of the order in order for it to be adopted. Once it's adopted, the time period for which the development that's been approved by the order can take place is going to be specified. And again, that's out to consultation at the moment. The government's proposing 10 years. They're proposing 10, 20, 30 years, or no time period, no time limit at all. And this is very interesting because this is a full-blown master plan at street level. This is what a street development order is actually going to be delivering. Interestingly, normal SIL and Section 106 rules will apply, so exemptions will remain in place for small development and offsets will be enforced, including the self-build offset. Thanks, Natasha. So the government wants to ensure that street vote development orders result in well-designed development. And the intention is it apparently is going to improve the conditions of existing streetscapes and take account of their local impacts, i.e. local development, local impacts. The government also wants to create what they see as a predictable system where qualifying groups in the wider community have a high degree of certainty on what development is likely to be permissible before they prepare a proposal. So to achieve this, the government is actually proposing that the proposals put forward for the order will include street design codes that are assessed against more precise requirements, which are going to be prescribed in secondary legislation. But the detailed design requirements are informed by 6 principles. They want to support a gradual evolution in the character of neighbourhoods. They want to limit impact on neighbours of any development that takes place on that street. They want to ensure that that street development, as part of the order, preserves green space and increases the amount of outdoor space, including balconies, available to people living on the street. They want to celebrate heritage. They want to promote active travel, and that means no cars, or giving people better choice other than use of a car. And they want to create sociable neighbourhoods. So the design requirements that they've already specified and are out to consultation on are as follows. They want to prescribe the thresholds on height by way of the number of floors on any given development in any defined street area. For example, in areas with fewer than 20 inhabitants per hectare, they want to cap the height of buildings at 2 stories. And in areas with between 20 and 60 inhabitants per hectare, they want to cap it at 3 stories. So it feels very arbitrary. This is something that's out to consultation at the moment, and I would strongly invite you to go and visit the site and have a look and actually pay into the consultation process. They want to place limits on development near neighbouring properties. So they're going to introduce light planes on a vertical and horizontal axis. So it's the 45-degree rule by another name, quite frankly. They want to put a maximum threshold on ceiling heights at 3.5 metres. They want to, and this is interesting, they want to introduce plot use limits, which basically means they want to limit the extent of the area within which a single house sits. They want to limit the area of garden that you can develop on if you've got a neighbouring residential property to the rear. And actually this is in direct conflict with the permitted development order, which currently allows a 50% threshold of the curtilage to be developed. In the event the order came into place on one street, you would only be able to develop a maximum of 25% of the area to the rear of the property if you had a neighbouring property to the back, if that makes any sense. Corner properties, they're saying, can only receive permissions if both streets on which they're sited are subject to a street vote development order. And then there are other regulations they're proposing to preserve active facades for pedestrians. For example, they suggesting there shouldn't be any more than 15 metres between any two front doors. It feels very inaccessible. Thanks, Natasha. We can move on. It really feels quite inaccessible at the moment, and interpreting these particular design requirements, because this will be down to you. They don't expect anybody other than designers to get involved in the creation of these orders. Where you as professionals aren't supporting the eligible group to develop a proposal in accordance with the design requirements, it's going to carry a lot less weight when it gets to its examination in public. So, you know, you might argue there could be a huge amount of work out there for you, but nobody seems to have considered the financial implications. How does a street come together and everybody shoulder the cost of appointing a design professional to help them develop what in effect is a detailed master plan for their street? I mean, I don't know. You know, begs the question how successful they're going to be. I think we're still, though, there's no specific concerns amongst us as planning professionals around the idea of design requirements. I think we've got an issue with them being, even now at this early stage, very complex and difficult to interpret. I've just given you a really quick taster there of what they might entail. But if we're finding them tricky to navigate, goodness knows how the general public's going to find them, quite frankly. But given how important it is to understand the requirements, these design requirements, given how important it's going to be for those to be understood in order for the production of an effective and credible SVDO, I think, you know, government should be advised to make full use of visual explanations, worked examples, use everyday language, and there can't be any room for differing interpretations of the design requirements. Because if you as the professionals are there leading a community forward on this, you could be at the middle of a big storm where neighbours are falling out with one another because they are finding there isn't a communal language around you know, the design code for their street, etc., etc. So, you know, over to you on that one, because I think it'll be interesting to see what happens next. And as I said, out to consultation, no time frame for delivery, but the order, the idea of these is now enacted in law, so they will happen at some point. Thanks, Natasha. So that's all I can say really on street vote development orders. I'm going to move on quickly to national development management policies, and just to say by way of introduction to these, again, no timetable for their introduction, but they are going to have a hugely, in our view, beneficial effect at some levels, but it will also throw the local development plan system up in the air. Thanks, Natasha. There's only really one quick slide on this. So the LURA provides basically for a new suite of national development management policies, and it's doing this by amending Section 38 of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act in 2004. So in effect, what that's saying is that regard must now be had in decision making and plan making to national development management policies. And this is particularly important for planning applications. The Act actually gives the Secretary of State a very broad power as well to create these suite of policies, or this suite of policies. They can, in effect, produce what they like. Because the policy, as it's been defined in the Act, is very loose. And as it's defined in the Act, the following is said. It's a policy, in brackets, however expressed, of the Secretary of State in relation to the development or use of land in England or any part of England, which the Secretary of State by direction designates as a national development management policy. So in effect, these policies can cover anything that the government sees fit to include if it relates to the matter of the development or use of land in England. I mean, that's huge. It's an absolutely huge remit. And you know, who knows where it will lead us. But the balance between development plans and national policy has now been transformed by the LURA. I mean, during the debate on the debate on the bill before the Act came into play and it gained royal assent, spokespeople for the government repeatedly stated that these policies, the National Development Management policies, were intended to reduce duplication between local plans. The idea being they would focus solely on those national policy tests that tended to be repeated across the country, such as greenbelt protections or heritage conservation. But what's astonishing is that the Act has made nothing in its wording to ensure that that's the case. So in effect, they could cover elements that aren't necessarily duplicated across the country. We'll have to wait and see. But the Act has provided now that decisions should be in accordance on planning application, in accordance with both the development plan and the suite of national development management policies. And they're given equal weight unless material considerations strongly indicate otherwise. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with that phrase, but before the Act was introduced, it was the word strongly wasn't in there. The test was to comply with the provisions of the development plan and the NPPF taken together unless material considerations indicated otherwise. Now, in order to either depart from the development plan or the national management development policies, one has to put material considerations forward that are strongly indicating you should depart. And that's a big thing. I think the courts are going to have a field day with all of this in the next couple of years. But how it ultimately works will depend on the regulations made and the willingness of the Secretary of State to use his extensive intervention powers. I mean, it's very exciting in theory, but in reality, we think it could lead to improper consultation and it could allow local planning authorities to have too much flexibility in how they apply the policies themselves. So that's them in a nutshell. And I'll take any questions, obviously, at the end if you have any. So thanks, Natasha. And then moving on swiftly to biodiversity net gain. I think we can just move on to the next slide, actually, Natasha. It's fine. Okay, so I think just to recap on where we were last year with this, no different. BNG, biodiversity net gains, already required through national planning policy and the Environment Act, and now the LURA. It puts it on a statutory footing. And as I said last year, it does signal a new form of natural capital whose stated purpose is to put a price on nature and to ensure that habitats are enhanced. So enhancement, again, it remains the case. It can be delivered on or off site or by way of a combination of both. Thanks, Natasha. One of the things the LURA has done is that it has introduced a new metric, and that actually is the statutory biodiversity metric, which was published in draft form in November 2023. It followed the publication of the biodiversity metric 4.0, which was published in April 2023. But it in effect doesn't make a huge amount of change to the 4.0 version. It is just now the statutory tool against which biodiversity units are valued. So they're calculated, biodiversity units according to the statutory biodiversity metric are calculated in area now, area, hedgerow and watercourse units. The metric calculates how many units a habitat contains before development takes place and how many units are needed to replace the units of habitat lost and to achieve a 10% gain through the creation or enhancement of habitat on site or elsewhere. The 10% rule applies to each type of unit, whether it's area, hedgerow or watercourse, and as of the 12th of February 2024, it applies to major development statutorily as defined by the Town and Country Planning Act 1990. Small sites will be subject to the statutory 10% uplift from the 2nd of April 2024, and nationally significant infrastructure projects will come online in terms of having to provide uplift in November 2025. So small sites, just for those who might not be clear, are those defined as one for residential, where the number of dwellings to be provided is between 1 and 9. On sites of less than 1 hectare, or where the number of dwellings to be provided is not known, a site of less than 0.5 hectares. So threshold 1 to 9 dwellings and sites of less than 1 hectare, where numbers aren't known, site area can't be any greater than 0.5 hectares. For non-residential development to qualify as a small site, the floor space to be created must be less than 1,000 square metres, or where the site area is less than 1 hectare. So to be very clear here, the new biodiversity metric is not a Natural England metric. It has been published by the Secretary of State, and the intention is that Natural England will make recommendations to the Secretary of State every 3 to 5 years, helping update the content of the metric according to what's falling out the other end of it. But from day one of mandatory biodiversity net gains, so for major development, that's as of the 12th of February, all applications needing to submit a metric must use the statutory biodiversity metric and not the Natural England version 4.0. Thanks, Natasha. And here's an example. So this is a scheme that we've been dealing with in Sheffield, and our ecologist in December, knowing what was happening, has actually applied the statutory biodiversity metric in that case. So in that instance, when they were calculating the baseline biodiversity value, they took into consideration habitat area, the condition, the distinctiveness of the habitat and its strategic significance. And then post-intervention, the value of the mitigation that they've calculated was affected by uncertainty in the effectiveness of management techniques used to enhance or create habitat. The average time, this is really important, between starting the intervention and the habitat reaching its target conditions, and the spatial risk, which is only applied to off-site interventions where there's less control over its lifetime. So less value can be given to it. The traffic light flag system is an integral part of the statutory metric. So red signals a major issue, amber a potential issue, and green means there's no metric rule breaks, so all is good in the world. The statutory metric must now in law be completed by a competent person, so a qualified ecologist or other competent professional. It doesn't override existing protections given to existing habitats. Existing professional practice around the management of those habitats will continue to apply. We can't treat this as a complex ecological model. It is a bit of a blunt tool yet again. We can only sort of take it as a proxy for biodiversity. That's all it's offering up to us. But it is designed to inform decision making, and weight is being given to it by local authorities. Above all, the metric now expects interventions to be appropriate and realistic, and for compensation to be local and strategic. There is no minimum habitat size ratio. Thank you, Natasha. And again, I mean, the message here is very, very easy. It's avoid, mitigate and compensate. The preference, of course, is to ensure enhancements on site, then off site, and only as a last resort, ensuring mitigation by way of the use of statutory credits. What we're finding on this is a lot of our clients are actually looking to acquire land that they will bank and use to deliver their biodiversity net gains moving forward. We have an interesting situation in a case in Bassett Law, where we have a developer who's acquired a site with planning permission. They've built the site out and they've acquired land alongside it, which was identified as part of the planning permission for the creation of an orchard. And the question we're now asking of the local authority is, that orchard, believe it or not, the permission was granted before the whole B&G issue blew up. The question being asked of the local authority is, can our developer actually use the creation of that habitat, i.e. the orchard, even though it's a requirement of a separate planning permission, to offset biodiversity loss on another site we're working on in an urban area where we just can't deliver gain on site. So that's an interesting debate that I think we're going to see emerge. But I think that's, mitigation, securing it, the hierarchy, avoid, minimize, compensate. Off-site units can be secured via condition or by way of Section 106. We're finding most local authorities are favouring the condition route, even if they don't have up-to-date supplementary planning guidance in play in their administrative area, rather than the cost of a Section 106. The National Land Register, that's an interesting one. We're trying to encourage as many clients as possible to start registering land against it, so that there is an effective land bank being built up that developers can access and use as a community to help offset loss in particular instances. Mitigation by type. This is what we're finding from the ecologists that we're working with. They're less certain about long-term mitigation being successful wherever it is, because there's no certainty around whether a tree that you plant now will survive and be there in 30 years' time, how it might be policed, etc. There's also some tension we're finding emerging between landscape architects that we work with and ecologists, because the landscape architects fully understand and appreciate the ecologist's role is to set the biodiversity metric running in order to determine whether there's a loss, a neutral effect or a gain, and how it might be mitigated, how any loss might be mitigated for. The landscape architect's concerns are that it needs to be done in a beautiful way, and ecologists are all about units. So there's an interesting dynamic emerging there where landscape architects, I think, need to and want to take a better, more involved role in the decision making around mitigation. Thank you, Natasha. And again, just to repeat the message of last year, which was biodiversity should be considered from the point of acquisition, the implications for the submission of planning applications, around the fact that should be factored in at the early stage, noting that certain survey work can only be undertaken at specific times of the year. And I don't know about you, but at the moment we've got a number of applications held up on the grounds that either we have survey work that's out of date, or we simply need survey work that we can't undertake quite yet because, for example, with bats, they're not going to emerge till April, May time. And so a lot of stuff is being held up in the system. Elected members, we're finding, are heavily scrutinising any scheme that comes forward where there's an acknowledged loss on site, and they need to understand where the mitigation is to be delivered. The national credit scheme is not popular, as you might imagine, amongst elected members, because they can't guarantee that those units will be spent in their administrative area. So early stakeholder engagement is going to be key on the bigger sites. I see little of it. In Wales, there is the PAC system, which is the pre-application consultation system, which captures this as well. And it's a far more comprehensive approach to the whole idea of engagement with third parties. Whether something will follow on the back of LURA in England, I don't know. But there still remains a degree of uncertainty around the whole process. The Royal Town Planning Institute most recently feeding back into the BNG issue with central government, made it clear that over, I think it was something like 48% of local authorities felt they didn't have sufficient expertise in-house to deal with the issue going forward. So that's going to be a big problem, because it means applications will be held up in the system. Thank you, Natasha. Okay, so moving on, and the final section, permitted development rights. So this consultation, again, up on the www.gov.uk website. Do go on there and have a look and feed into it, because I think you'll find it interesting and your feedback's important. But a whole new suite of permitted development rights are being consulted upon, and as ever, this follows the sort of the aspirations in the planning white paper that preceded the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, which is now the Act, where the government really wanted to make the system far more accessible and more flexible. I don't know about you, but we now find in our practice that the Town and Country Planning General Permitted Development Order has become a huge instrument that is sometimes really difficult to navigate, and we're still waiting for it to be consolidated. It hasn't happened yet. If these changes come in, we'll be waiting a long time to come. So thanks, Natasha. So on these particular amendments, they are out of consultation. As I say, I think it's the 9th of April it ends, the consultation process, but the summary of those changes being proposed. So classes A and B to part 1 of Schedule 2, I'm assuming a lot of you should be familiar with this, or will be rather than should be, sorry. It's around alterations and extensions to the dwellings themselves, including to their roofs. They want to create greater flexibility around that. Building upwards rights extended under Class AA of Part 1 and Class A, AA, AC and AD of Part 20. I have never actually employed these yet as a planning consultant. So although I can read about them and understand them to a point, I haven't engaged with them on the ground. The right to demolish and rebuild as homes is another area of the order that the government wants to make more flexible. And then they want to introduce changes under classes D and E of Part 2 around the provision or installation of electrical outlets and upstands for recharging electric vehicles. And then Class G, the installation of air source heat pumps, they really want to push forward under relaxed provisions. Thanks, Natasha. So, as I've said, the government is proposing to provide householders with further flexibility to undertake larger improvements, extensions and alterations. In the case of smaller single-storey rear extensions, the proposal is to allow dwellings and householders, in the case of a detached dwelling, to extend to 5 metres at the rear, as opposed to the 4 metres that is allowed at present. And in all other cases, the projection will be increased from 3 to 4 metres, but all other criteria around those single-storey extensions will remain in place. With reference to 2-storey extensions, the intention is to increase the projection permitted from 3 to 4 metres, and it's also intended to lift the requirement to ensure the height of the improvement or alteration does not exceed the height to eaves of the existing dwelling. The rule that limits the distance between an extended property and the rear boundary, the boundary opposite the rear wall of the dwelling being enlarged, which is currently 7 metres, that will be scrapped. And that then, in my view, puts us back potentially in conflict with the SVDOs, where we potentially have this 25% of the curtilage rule. There's an uncomfortable kind of dynamic developing there. Another change, and one that I really welcome, is in relation to the matter of material finishes. The government wants to propose the removal of the constraint that requires the proposed material finish to be similar, that's the word, similar in appearance to the materials used on the exterior of the existing dwelling. I think they're beginning to acknowledge what a constraint that might be. And on the matter of side extensions, whoopee, finally we're there. Side extension meets rear extension, never the twain could. But where currently a side extension cannot measure a width greater than half the width of the original dwelling, hence the reason of not being able to join rear and side, because we then are into a whole sort of issue of cumulative development. Wraparound development is proposed, and I think it's very sensible. The government just recognises the problem. So, all hail the government on that one. I think these changes are all very welcome, frankly. Thanks, Natasha. So in relation to Class B, they do want to provide householders with further flexibility to undertake larger improvements, extensions and alterations to the roof. So the 40 and 50 cubic metre threshold on volumetric increases to roof spaces as a cumulative amount they want to abolish. The intention to have any alteration set back from the eaves by 20 centimetres, they want to abolish that, where the alterations are not visible from the street. And therein lies a whole other debate. What is and is not visible? And do you take terrain into account? In Sheffield, we have a lot of terrain changes, steep topography. You might be on a street, you know, above another street and see a roof that wouldn't be visible from the street on which that property is actually located. Does that mean it's visible from the street? The other alteration is in relation to velux or anything that pops out of the roof plane vertically. So they want to get rid of the 0.15 metre threshold and give more flexibility around that. On the matter of Class E outbuildings, this is an interesting one, and I think it'll have very little effect overall, but the idea is to be able to allow Class E outbuildings to project forward of the principal elevation where currently they can't under the order, and grant express consent for small structures. I think it's 2 metres long by 1.5 metres in height to allow bin stores and bike stores to be delivered, particularly in relation to terrace properties. And then in relation to freestanding outbuildings, I don't know if you're aware, but currently anything in an Article 2.3 area which is located more than 20 metres from the parent property, its footprint is limited to 10 square metres. They want to abolish that threshold in Article 2.3 areas. Thanks, Natasha. And then Class AA of Part 1 and Class A, AA, AB, AC and AD of Part 20, the whole idea of building upwards, which allows for upwards extensions of buildings to create new homes and provide additional living space for growing families. The rights apply to a range of different buildings currently, including mixed use, commercial and residential buildings. But they're subject to limitations and conditions. They do not, for example, apply to properties in Article 2.3 land. But the government's very keen to review this, the permitted development order as it relates to upward extensions in these classes to make sure they're currently fit for purpose. The intention is to extend further the powers of the order, so to enable buildings constructed pre-1948, which is currently a limitation, to be extended upwards without planning permission. And in addition, the government's seeking views in this consultation paper on whether the prior approval process can be streamlined some more. It isn't proposing changes to prior approval matters that relate to safety, including the impacts on air traffic, defence assets and fire safety where the building's over 18 metres high. But they're wondering whether or not the whole process could be made more accessible by streamlining it. As regards the construction of new dwellings on a freestanding block of flats, Class A to Part 20 currently allows for 2 additional stories up to 7 metres in height to be added to an existing building, provided the maximum height is no more than 30 metres post-extension. The government's seeking feedback on the appropriateness of the safeguards via the prior approval process, which are currently in place, around matters of noise, dust, vibration and traffic, and with reference impact on amenities of existing and neighbouring premises. And in that regard, they might be looking to pull back a little bit because presently there are some concerns about the permitted development rights being capable of impacting on leaseholders who own a flat within a block of flats where the freeholder is undertaking the upwards extension. And then under Class ZA of Part 20, which addresses demolition and rebuild, this presently grants express consent for the demolition of certain single detached buildings, including flats, offices, research and development and industrial units falling within definition Class B1. And the construction of a block of flats in its place. To date, the building cannot have been constructed post 1989, but the proposal now is to remove that limitation. So buildings post-dating 1989 can now potentially be demolished and rebuilt. Permission does not currently place a limit on the age of the building and this to be demolished, and this is being amended. They're also seeking views on whether, rebuilding the footprint, and I think this is a really interesting one. So at present under Class ZA, if you put a building back up in place of a building you've taken down, the footprint must follow exactly the same footprint of its predecessor. They want to abolish that and allow an increase by way of 100% of 200 square metres in the size of the footprint, whichever is the greater. Again, they're asking for feedback on whether the prior approval process for Class Z is too onerous at present. Thanks, Natasha. And then finally, with reference classes D and E of Part 2, electrical outlets and upstands for recharging EVs. At present, there's only a limitation on these insofar as they can't be located within 2 meters of the highway. I think everybody feels that's a bit onerous. The government wants to abolish that threshold and to allow for an increase in the height of the upstands from 2.3 meters to 2.7. They're also looking at trying to increase the permitted development rights around the installation of larger infrastructure, housing for equipment or storage cabinets to support the operation of bigger or more powerful upstands, which is a good thing. And then Class G Part 14, air source heat pumps, currently requires that all heat pumps must be located at least 1 meter from the boundary of the property, premised on the effect that the air source heat pump could have by way of noise on a neighbouring amenity. But this is now seen as an unnecessary barrier. It was introduced, as I said, as a blunt proxy for noise, and they want to get rid of that. And that's the PD rights in a nutshell. Again, go onto the www.gov.uk website, look at the consultation paper. It's interesting, and if you want to feed into it, the opportunity is there. Thanks, Natasha. So that's it. I've bored you for 56 minutes, and yeah, I've run through it. I'm as mesmerized by all of this as many of you might be. So please fire questions at me, but don't be offended if I say I don't know by way of an answer.
Thank you.
Natasha?
That was really interesting. A lot of food for thought, I think, but everything looks quite positive, I think, in terms from a design point of view going forward, which is good. I'm just reading through to see if there's any questions. So we've got, is the commencement notice mentioned in LURA S.111 the same given by building control inspector?
Say that again, Natasha, because I can't actually see that question.
It says,
I can see it, just ignore me. Is the commencement notice meant in your section 1 the same given by... that's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to that. Although I'm a specialist in planning, we have very little crossover with building control, but I can find that out and certainly put some information across to Natasha if that would help.
Yes, please.
Okay.
And then we've just got one other question. It says, what changes does the LURA make to planning application for residential alterations such as extensions?
So the LURA doesn't make any changes to the existing legislation for house extensions. That is covered within the Town and Country Planning General Permitted Development Order. So that's a really interesting question, actually. So Section 55 of the Town and Country Planning Act, which hasn't been amended by the LURA, defines development, and then the Town and Country Planning General Permitted Development Order takes that development and grants it's called express consent for specific kinds of that development. So if we're going to talk about alterations and extensions to dwellings, we talk about it in the context primarily of Section 55 of the Town and Country Planning Act and the Permitted Development Order. So if you take those two together, the LURA is a much more sort of an overarching piece of legislation which has a much broader effect.
Perfect. We just had another question. It says, does an SVDO replace PD, or would an applicant still be able to choose the PD route or SVDO or even full planning?
Yeah, really good question. I wasn't sure to begin with, but yes, the answer to that simply is yes. How that will sit, I mean, what we've discussed in the office here, if you imagine you've got an SVDO put in place and then you sell your house, and the person coming into your house sees this design code that's been drawn up in a master plan for their street and goes, well, I actually don't want to do that to my house. I want to do something very different. So they will have the permitted development route left open to them, and they will have the planning application route left open to them. What they won't anticipate, and I suspect could become really controversial, is a fight with their neighbours. Because can you imagine a community has paid all this money to put an order in place. So, and the reason I talk about money is because I've been involved in the preparation of a couple of neighbourhood development plans, and they've been very, very costly for the community, the third sectors that have taken them on to produce. I've worked pro bono on one, and had I put fees to it, it would have been in the region of about, you know, £20,000–30,000. Now, how is a community going to pull together on a street of potentially just 10 houses and put a development order forward with the help of a design specialist? I mean, we'll wait and see. Let's see what happens. But yeah, so no, you'll have your PD route and you'll have your SVDO route.
Perfect. I think that's it now for questions.
Okay. If there's anything that flows out of this at all, Natasha, beyond it, I know I've ranted on, but by all means, put any questions through to Natasha and I'll happily answer them.
I've got one little question before we
Yes.
disappear.
Yes, James.
I have a client who's got a planning approval for the conversion of a warehouse into 18 flats, and it runs out in August this year. Now, he's asked me to prepare a new application using all the original documentation. Now, with the new application going in, even though it's overlapping the existing permission, will all of this criteria come into play on the new application, or is there a dispensation for when you apply and you still got a current permission existing? Is there any ramifications?
That's a good question, and principally I have to be perfectly frank and say we don't know. We genuinely don't know. We have a lot of clients in this situation. I think if there's evidence amongst local authorities, and of course this will have to be resourced. So, you know, how do you decide that as somebody is a perpetual applicant submitting the same scheme time and again? At what point does that actually become something you need to address by way of declining to determine the application? We don't know. Now, we're going to get some local authorities are going to be quite heavy-handed and go, no, you've had your permission, don't come back to me again. You know, the framework hasn't altered unless you think there's a material consideration that suggests we need to reconsider your position because it's not viable or whatever. Go away. We don't know. We genuinely, I suspect, and the courts will probably prove me right. The lawyers are clapping and, you know, jumping up and down in joy because these are going to end up in the courts for the next 2 to 3 years. Or we get a change of government and everything is scrapped.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much for that.
Sorry, James. I hope that helps.
I think that's it now for questions. No, thank you so much, Susan. It's really appreciated that you've given your time